Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Paul. And I want to express a special thanks to Dr. Andy Bibby, who has done so much work, I know, putting this conference together. I'm honored to be invited with such an illustrious group of scholars that you've assembled. I also want to thank the honorable members of the Utah State Legislature. It's not every day that politicians spend their time thinking about the principles of constitutional democracy. We could use more of that in Washington, and it's good to see that it's happening in Utah. And finally, Dr. Ralph Hancock, my old friend, what a pleasure to see him. His work on Tocqueville is some of the best that there is, and is one of the things I think we need to study when we're thinking about federalism today. So thank you for having me. When I listened to John Dinan's talk, and he mentioned that in, I think, Oklahoma, no county supported Obama, but in Vermont, just the reverse, none supported Romney. I couldn't help but thinking, I mean, this is part of the federal system today, for better or worse, isn't it? You know, Texas, Ted Cruz. Vermont, Bernie Sanders. Texas, conservatives. Vermont, progressives, even socialists. Texas, Miranda Lambert. Vermont, fish with a PH. You know, Texas, ranches. Vermont, communes. Texas, anti-legalization of pot, but pro-beer. Vermont, you don't need to legalize marijuana. It's never been illegal. You've got the Texas trifecta, right? Cowboy hat, cowboy boots, and a very big belt buckle. In Vermont, shorts and a ski parka. I grew up on the border of Vermont on Lake Champlain. But in all seriousness, and you know, in Texas, pro-gun, Vermont anti-gun, Texas anti-abortion, Vermont pro-choice. Texas, 6% of the people consider themselves non-religious. In Vermont, 58% of the people consider themselves non-religious. What to do about this? Do we celebrate diversity? Or do we try to create a more uniform system? And if so, on what principles? Well, I passed out, or rather Top passed out a little handout for me. This is just a guide. It's a few of quotations from Madison over the sort of founding years, just to refer to from time to time, because I'm not very good with PowerPoint, but also for you to keep in case these are things you might want to explore a little bit further. So I think Jack Rakoff is absolutely right that under the weaknesses, under the Articles of Confederation, Madison, in Vices of the Political System, was very concerned with the weaknesses, among which was the fact that the states retained their sovereignty and that it was simply voluntary compliance. The central government, such as it was, there wasn't really, it didn't have much real authority, was really just sort of a league, probably not even as strong as the United Nations today. So to fast forward, the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Madison, of course, writes the Virginia report, or I'm sorry, the Virginia plan that Edmund Randolph will deliver, and he wants a much stronger central government. Interestingly enough, we were talking in the car on the way over the van. I don't know if Christine is here and Top, but they were asking the question, well, when did federalism become almost synonymous with nationalism, so we talk about the central or federal or national government? Because in Madison's time, federalism and confederalism were the same thing. There were essentially two choices, confederalism and federalism, or a unitary or consolidated government. And I think Madison does try to carve out, ultimately, a sort of a third way, what he calls a middle course. But essentially, so he wants one thing in particular, many things, but one thing very fundamental to change under the new Constitution, because he goes to Philadelphia, as they say in Western Pennsylvania, loaded for bear. And the states are no longer to be sovereign. But, I would argue, neither is a national government. It's the people who are to be recognized as sovereign because they are the only real sovereigns in the world that Madison understood. So the Constitution begins, we the people. Not we the people of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Virginia, as originally planned, but we the people of the United States. This creates another problem, though. The people do not always rule justly. This wasn't a news alert. Madison had recognized this in his study of ancient modern confederacies and his vices of the political system of the United States. He had wrestled with this problem, and he would continue to wrestle with it for years to come. The problem was that the people, manifested in the power of the majority, have might on their side, but they may not themselves be on the side of justice, on the side of right. What to do about this? Now, some of you students here have probably studied Federalist 10, and you've looked at Madison's solution. So the problem is faction, particularly majority faction. And his solution is, first, contrary to the old ideas, ways of thinking about popular government, where you had to have a small territory, Madison says, let's extend the sphere and take in, you'll see on the handout, the first quotation, extend the sphere, and you take in a greater variety of parties and interests. You make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens, or if such a common motive exists, it will be more difficult for all who feel it to discover their own strength and to act in unison with each other. Because part of the problem of these partial groups vying against each other was at the state level, that the majorities in the states tended to be factious, unjust, especially in places like Rogue Island, as Washington liked to call it. So Madison thought if we extend the sphere, rather than thinking of republicanism, small r, in one state, where what we see is a lot of instability, injustice, and confusion, if we can think of 13 states, and remember the 13 states then were bigger than 13 states on the seaboard today, because Massachusetts included what? Maine, New York included Vermont, and so forth, that we'd have a fairly extensive territory, which, by the way, he thought would extend much further. And that way, somehow, we could come up with more just public policy. How? Well, first of all, so you extend the sphere, and then you have the need for representatives. And the job of representatives, not that they'll all do it, enlightened statesmen are not always at the helm, Madison says, but the job of the representative is to listen to his constituents, and his constituents in a certain territory may not always agree. So there's a discussion, a discourse that goes on, a kind of civic education, if you will. Refine and enlarge the public views whether it's at the state level or the national level, you go to the Assembly, to the Senate, and you discuss these things. And through this process, deliberation is naturally occurring. So extend the republic, representation. Now you've created a government that's separate from the people. It's not like the old Greek democracies. So now you want to put controls on the government. So Madison says what we need are auxiliary precautions, separation of powers, checks and balances, bicameralism. Let the Senate and the House duke it out sometimes. Put their ideas up against each other so that then more discourse, more deliberation, the chance for time and reason to happen in such a way that it refines and elevates the kind of outcome that you'll have will take place. And this is what he talks about in Federalist 51. Okay, so this is how we see federalism particularly emerge in Madison's theory of what he's up to in designing the constitutional way of life. So I think the overriding questions are these. What is Madison's constitutional design supposed to achieve? He spent all this time thinking this through, and the notes he takes on the ancient modern confederacies and the vices of the political system leading up to the convention, and the notes he's taking at the convention, and what he writes in the Federalist Papers. When he goes and serves in the first Congress of the United States in Philadelphia, he's just across the quad from the Pennsylvania State House, Independence Hall, staying at Mrs. House's boarding house on Market, then High Street and Fifth. And he would practically run back over there to get back to his books and think through these questions more. As soon as the first session, the first Congress ends, he buries himself in his books. Jefferson has to tug at him just to come out on a nice day to take a ride, you know, through the countryside, which I suppose means over as far as, well, maybe going out towards the Schuylkill. Because he wants to keep thinking it through. He hasn't quite got it all down yet. He's up to something. He's trying to achieve something, and federalism is a part of this. Who or what in Madison's scheme? Who possesses or what possesses sovereignty? Who is to rule in the Republican governments of the United States? And finally, how does federalism fit into this scheme? In other words, why federalism? Why not, as John Dinan said, why not administrative states? Wouldn't that work just as well to accomplish whatever it is that we want to accomplish in America? Well, for Madison, it wouldn't. Federalism is for him a principle. So let me see if I can trace his reasons for that briefly and make sure we have plenty of time for discussion. Well, first of all, the Bill of Rights. Madison is originally opposed to the Bill of Rights, and that is because he fears that if we start trying to enumerate the rights that people have, then there might be an assumption as we move forward that only those rights that we've listed in the Constitution are rights that people possess. And he does not want that to be the assumption. He wants it to be the reverse, that everything, that the powers of government are listed, and those rights and only those rights given to the national government are legitimately within their purview. The assumption should be on the side of the rights that the people retain. So it's the people who give powers to the government, not the government that gives rights to the people. Let me repeat that. This is critical. The people give powers to the government, to the national government. The national government does not give rights to the people. That was the old British system. That was not the American way. He finally agrees to the Bill of Rights. In fact, he's the one who introduces it, right, in the first Congress. But he says he does so with some hesitation, but he says if we do it carefully, maybe we can make sure that we won't misconstrue this, making sure we preserve the idea that this is a government of enumerated powers. And so that's one of the reasons for the 10th Amendment, right? Well, the 9th Amendment and the 10th Amendment. And I've listed the 10th Amendment on your sheet just to make sure we always remember that that is there to remind us the very nature of our constitutional compact. In 1791, after the first Congress ends, and Madison is back at Mrs. House's boarding house, writing his notes on government and trying to figure out even further how to make this system of small r republicanism work, he writes a series of essays which you might call the party press essays. They're published in a newspaper in Philadelphia by editor Philip Furneaux. And in these terse pieces, sort of op-eds, 19 of them, Madison lays out fairly extensively his ideas on the nature of the system and what it is that he is trying to achieve by his constitutional design. In the essay Charters, published in 1791, let me see if I can find that here. Oh, here we go. In the essay Charters, he says, in Europe, charters of liberty have been granted by power. It's on your handout. America has set the example, and France has followed it, of charters of power granted by liberty. And then he wants to talk about the solemnity of these acts, proclaiming the will and authenticated by the seal of the people, the only earthly source of authority, and thus ought to be our vigilance with which these charters are guarded by every citizen in private life, and the circumspection with which they are executed by every citizen in public trust. And he goes on, but let me read just a little bit more of this, because I want you to get not just the idea, but the feel of the importance of this to Madison. As compacts, charters of government are superior in obligation to all others, because they give effect to all others. As trusts, none can be more sacred, because they are bound on the conscience by the religious sanctions of an oath. And then he goes on to say, all power has been traced up to opinion. The stability of all governments depends on opinion. And so how devoutly it is to be wished then that public opinion in the United States should be enlightened, and that it should attach itself as delineated in the great charters, derived from the legitimate source of authority in the people. So, and then he goes on to sort of presage Abraham Lincoln, that these are kind of a holy civil scriptures, much like the scriptures that Lincoln will talk about, political scriptures in the Lyceum Address. What is Madison up to then? Note Madison's logic in this essay. First, the people are sovereign. Secondly, it is the people who give fundamental authority to the Constitution, which is why constitutions or charters are superior to ordinary acts of legislation. Remember, offices of government, branches of government, executive, legislative, judiciary, cannot be created until after there's a constitution. After the United States Constitution is formed and ratified, it's only after that that we first establish the legislature. And you have to have the legislature, right, before you can establish the executive. Because, why? Because what happens, think of the way you have to elect the executive, right, and the various provisions for that. And it's only after both of those branches are established that you can then establish a court, a Supreme Court. The Constitution is the umbrella over the government. It is the fundamental expression of the sovereignty of the people, which is why even a majority rule through their representatives in Congress in the policies they create must be consistent with the Constitution of the United States. It is an expression, a manifestation of the opinion of the public, of public opinion, in its highest sovereign capacity. So, constitutional government in the United States is meant to establish a government that can, when necessary, protect citizens against the injustice of a factious majority. Constitutional government is also designed to protect the people's liberties against a governmental overreach or abuse of power. Madison's emphases in charters, that is, that the people, or in other words, public opinion, is the source of all political power, and that it is the job of the people to watch over their government and control it, is fundamental to him. So, why federalism? What purpose does it serve? In his article, Consolidation, Madison makes clear that if you were to diminish too much, or particularly to abolish the state governments, what you would find is an increase in executive power. Remember the old truth of the great oracles of political wisdom, from Plato to Aristotle down through Montesquieu, that in a large territory, government almost necessarily becomes despotic. And think of the examples. Empires are despotic. Persia, China. What happens when the Roman Republic expands and it becomes the Roman Empire? Enter stage left, a Caesar. So large government over a large and populous territory tends to be despotic, with a very, very strong executive. In such a large territory as the 13 or more states, Madison argued, if you reduce the role of the states, the executive power will grow. The legislative power cannot deal with the things that such a large and populous territory would need. Things that, by right, in the United States are reserved to the states. For example, health, education, welfare, the police powers. The police powers are essentially the things that deal with the morals and manners of the people, from, the French call it la police. Those kinds of things are not only rightly at the state level because they're best dealt with there, and they're constitutionally left there because they are not powers delegated to the national government, but the national government cannot effectively handle those things anyway. So it's both a principle and expediency that this is based on. So Madison says, if you diminish the state governments, you'll have a growth of an executive power. And part of the reason that happens is that one of the jobs of the state governments is to collect the public voice and to serve as a vehicle for the expression of the public voice. This is what he says in, if you look on your handout under consolidation. Consolidation or centralization of power at the national level would result in an all too powerful executive and a feeble, powerless citizenry. Sorry, that's not Madison's quote, that's my summary. The quote is, consolidation, much has been said, and not without reason, middle of the page 2, against the consolidation of the states into one government. I'm going to skip. Were the state governments abolished, the same space of country that would produce an undue growth of the executive power would prevent that control on the legislative body, which is essential to a faithful discharge of its trust. Neither the voice nor the sense of 10 or 20 millions of people, imagine that of 330 million, spread throughout so many latitudes as are comprehended within the United States, could ever be combined or called into effect, or deprived, if deprived of these local organs, through which both can now be conveyed. Because what would happen is that government would be left to a self-directed course. There would not be the check on it by public opinion. And without that check on the government by public opinion, it's a natural tendency of every government to become despotic. This is precisely what Tocqueville is talking about in his opus, Democracy in America. Madison simply repeats this kind of argument in his essay, Public Opinion. Public opinion, he says, sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one. When public opinion is fixed, government must obey it. When it is not fixed, government, he means the representatives in government, may influence it. And that would, if we understand that, that'll decide for legislators, particularly, the respect that is due to public opinion, to their constituency. Now, what does he mean by that? Think of it, that when it's settled and not settled. This is the way the whole system is designed by Madison. He wants it to be hard to fix or settle, to form public opinion. Why? Because if it forms too easily, your majority will often become factious. That's the whole history of the old Greek city-states, right? But he doesn't want to stymie it, because to do that would leave government to a self-directed course, to create a despotism. So how do you have rule by the people, majority rule, and at the same time create a space and time and factors that influence it to refine and enlarge it so that the majority that rules will, to the extent possible, be a just majority? In the great extended Republic of the United States, that requires federalism. Federalism is a principle, not just an act of expediency. The state governments are responsible for two major jobs. One is those powers not enumerated to the national government, like health, education, welfare, police powers, and so on. The things that they can do well and do best. Secondly, it's where the people learn the tools of Republican government. It is where the people learn participation, where they learn give and take, where they learn public discourse. Imagine a nation without that, with only heads in Washington talking to each other. That is not Madison's vision. Madison's vision of America is a vision of a country in which the people actually govern themselves. But to govern themselves, they have to be capable of governing themselves. And the states are critical, not just in 1787 or in the 1830s when Tocqueville wrote, but today, absolutely critical, I think, in that enterprise. And I think it's something we've a bit forgotten about federalism today, the absolutely critical importance of it in a nation, in a constitutional democracy which hopes that the people can continue to govern themselves. Let me just say this in closing. I mean, what's to be done, though? Washington's there, and it's looming. It feels like it just, it looms in our houses on every TV where any of the news stations are on, CNN and Fox and MSNBC, and there are those people talking at us. What's a poor state to do? What are the majestic, mighty, 50-strong entities in this United States to do when pitted against 4 or 5 berobed, bespectacled founding members of the AARP? Thank you.